Tickets. Tickets, please. Step inside, take a ride upon the terror train. All aboard, be fair warned, these rails house fear and pain. Find a seat, don't mind the heat, just pray the lights stay on. Upon these rails, these bloody rails, in darkness lies no dawn. Yes, step inside, come crawl or glide, with us you shall remain. Upon this ride, this hellish ride, we call the terror train. Ticket, please. James Ward Kirk Publications presents Terror Train. Episode 121. Oregon to California.
Welcome aboard. Welcome to my home. I am the Disembodied Voice, your ghost host, so to speak. Call me Terror. Welcome to my train. Be you dead, undead, or of the living. Tonight, a lone passenger boards the terror train. Thomas and Malafarina. Thomas has spent quite an intriguing tale in exchange for his mortal soul. A fugitive takes a ride on a train where his fellow passengers are eerily familiar. Ooh, like that one there in the shadows. Do you see him, Thomas? I do believe he's lost his head. Take a look around, Thomas. The passengers here are simply dying to meet you. To our conductor, which reads Thomas and Malafarina. This train.
Ticket, please. This Train by Thomas M. Malafarina. The man in black sprawled in his seat in the empty Pullman passenger car. He panted, practically out of breath. His long, lean legs stretched out in front of him. His feet, snakeskin boots, rested comfortable in the aisle. Sweat beaded on his forehead and dripped down the back of his neck. He took off his dusty black Stetson, placed it on the seat next to him, and removed his kerchief to mop his brow. How in Sam Hill had he been so lucky to get away? The deck had been stacked against him. But here he was, alive, and escaping on this train. So he thanked his lucky stars for whatever fortune had befallen him. The man's real name was Jefferson Lincoln Carson, but he went by the moniker the Carson City Kid, a name he had picked up somewhere along the line. Carson stretched out his arms, expecting to be sore or stiff from injuries he might have received during his escape, but was surprised to find no muscle aches. He looked around at his luxuriant surroundings. The seats, covered with plush red velvet, the brass and oak interior polished to a shimmering luster. He had never seen anything quite like it before. Carson thought again about his narrow escape, and tried to figure out just how he managed to find his way onto this locomotive. He had robbed the First National Bank, and then fled the scene. He had thrown the sacks of loot over his getaway horse, and thought he was galloping safely out of town. That damned sheriff, Walter Cobb, and a posse of better than 20 men at full bore, guns blazing. He had been sure he was a dead man. His stomach lurched with terror. His heart lodged in his throat as guns roared, and bullets whizzed past his head. Frantic, Carson whipped his horse mercilessly and dug his spurs into its flanks as he urged the beast onward. He pushed the horse to its limits, as if the devil himself was after him. Just when he thought he was out of range, one of the low-down polecats shot his horse right out from under him. He recalled falling to the ground and lying with his left leg pinned under the nag. Carson imagined being captured by the posse and strung up over the nearest tree. He would dangle by his neck, legs kicking, gasping for air, until he finally breathed his last. His body would remain hanging for weeks, until the crows or other scavengers slowly picked his flesh. Soon all that remained would be a maggot-infested, half-eaten carcass. He heard the thundering hooves of the approaching posse, and somehow managed to wriggle free, get to his feet, and limp away. He had thought his leg would be broken, or at least aching, but so far his luck had held. Carson had somehow managed to get his leg free and tried to retrieve the money sacks, but to his dismay he had to abandon them in a hail of bullets which came raining down on him from the posse. He had fled for his life down into a canyon, running along the side of a stream. Just when he thought the posse was going to get him, a heavy fog had rolled in off the water and filled the valley, blocking his pursuer's vision. They continued to shoot wildly into the fog, but he somehow, miraculously, managed to elude them. As soon as he cleared the fog bank, he saw the train just getting ready to pull out from the station. He couldn't recall there being any train station in the valley, or tracks for that matter, but he knew better than to look a gift horse in the mouth, especially since his own horse was dead. He managed to jump onto the moving passenger car just in time to escape. As he rested, Carson saw a sickly-looking, pale-skinned stranger, dressed in a dusty black suit, enter at the far end of the car. The man wore a rather expensive-looking Stetson, similar to Carson's, but in much better condition. Carson nodded briefly at the stranger. He suddenly realized how much he might like to steal that fancy new Stetson. The stranger didn't nod back. He just sat, staring through dark, deep-set eyes. An unexplainable cold chill ran down his spine. The man's actions seemed to be a mite unneighborly. Such a lack of common courtesy riled Carson, perhaps more than it should have. He got to thinking that in a different set of surroundings, like in the saloon, the stranger might have found himself with a belly full of lead. God knows Carson had killed for less. He had made up his mind that the stranger's fancy hat would be his before this trip was over, and mayhaps the stranger would come up missing from this train as well. Before Carson could think any more on the subject, the door at the far end of the car opened again, and another man slunk in to take a seat across the aisle from the first. This man, likewise, stared silently at Carson. This one wore dirty range clothing and was clearly a cowpoke or a farmhand. Then the door opened again, and another man entered, followed by yet another, and then another. They all sat silently staring at Carson. He had a strange sensation that perhaps all of these characters knew each other. They might all be in cahoots, possibly planning some sort of move against him. Even though he had no real reason to feel this way, Carson had always been a man who lived by his gut. And right now, his gut was screaming at him to be on his guard. He reached down slowly with both hands and placed them on the walnut-handled grippers of his trusty six-shooters. He didn't know what these characters had in mind, but he would be ready for whatever it might be. Those guns had gotten him out of a passel of trouble throughout the years. They had also brought down more than their share of varmints of both the four-legged and two-legged varieties. If this bunch of tenderfeet thought they could take him, they were about to see the error of their ways. Carson sat perfectly still, watching the staring strangers, and waiting for the right moment to make his move. The door opened yet again, and several more men entered, each taking available seats and sitting quietly. All of their haunting eyes seemed to bore holes into Carson. Finally, the door opened one last time, and a woman entered. She wore a tight, red, frilly dance hall gal dress, and her hair was pinned way up high, just the way Carson liked it. Her skin was pale as a china doll. He found it disturbing how her pallid flesh made her ruby lips appear much too red. She wore a blood-red silken scarf around her neck. She stood in the aisle. Her eyes never left Carson. She reached up and began slowly removing the scarf from her neck. As she did so, she revealed a set of black, gruesome-looking handprint bruises encircling her long, thin porcelain neck. When Carson looked into her dark, sunken eyes, his breath caught in his throat. Those eyes bore the dead, stark emptiness of a corpse. They seemed completely void of emotion. He recognized that look immediately as the same dead stare his own soulless eyes reflected back at him from a looking-glass. But there was something else. Her eyes spurred another sudden recognition within him. He sat up straight and shouted, "No! No! That can't be!" He knew he couldn't possibly be seeing what he was seeing. It was Belle. His Belle. She had been his lover many years earlier. She had deceived him by sharing her bed with another man. And Carson had strangled her for the betrayal. Carson knew she was a dance hall girl, a whore, but he had fallen for her anyway, and fool enough to believe there might be more than lusty good times between them. He had believed her when she told him she loved him and his eyes. Carson had even considered giving up his outlaw ways and taking Belle far away from her life of sin. But he soon learned she couldn't change her ways. When she did him wrong, she not only tore his heart from his chest, but made him insane with rage. That was why he had wrapped his hands around her thin, frail neck, squeezing ever tighter until her eyes bugged from their sockets, and she finally stopped breathing. Those bruises he now saw on the throat of this unholy creature before him were the ones he had put there. But how could Belle be here on this train, standing in this passenger car? Then, with horror, he realized something that had previously escaped him. These were not strangers, as he had originally thought. The one over there in the business suit was Jacob Whitman. He had been a card shark, and Carson had murdered him more than 6 years earlier. And that Stetson he was wearing was not just nicer than his, but he realized it actually was his, as it had appeared the day Carson had taken it from Whitman's cooling corpse. And that cowpoke across the aisle from Whitman, wasn't that? Yes, it most certainly was Pecos Bill. But Carson had shot Pecos through the heart more than 2 years ago after quarreling. Carson slowly looked more carefully at each of the remaining silent passengers, and to his horror, he recognized them, and realized he had killed every one of them. But how could this be? It was as if the air around him was suddenly becoming thick and heavy. He felt like he did whenever he had a nightmare about facing down a rival in the street. In those dreams, when he tried to draw his guns, his lightning speed was gone, replaced by a slow and heavy, useless motion. He knew during those nightmares he was about to die, and that same feeling coursed through his body now. In those dreams, when he tried to draw his guns, his lightning speed was gone, replaced by a slow and heavy, useless motion. He knew during those nightmares he was about to die, and that same feeling coursed through his body now. The hair on his arms and the back of his neck rose, and his guts tightened. Beads of sweat returned to his brow. One by one, the ashen-faced passengers rose from their seats. Carson suspected what they might have in mind. He had not survived in his line of work for so long without knowing how to read a man's intentions. He pulled his guns out of their holsters, only to find his hands empty, pointing absolutely nothing at the crowd as they shambled slowly up the aisle toward him. Carson's muscles tensed and his heart beat frantically in his chest. What the hell was going on? Where were his trusty six-shooters? He looked down at his empty hands, then out at the approaching crowd, and knew this was not a bad dream. It was something much, much worse than a nightmare. This was real. And now he was trapped on this train, this god-forsaken train to who knows where, with a carload of what? Ghosts? Devils? Carson tried to get out of his seat with the hope of fleeing the mass of horrifying creatures, but discovered he was paralyzed. Soon he was surrounded by the horde. They simultaneously opened their mouths, revealing giant black caverns full of long, dagger-sharp fangs. They raised their hands, and Carson saw claws, the likes of those he had seen on many a mountain lion. Soon the lumbering throng fell upon him, and pulled on his arms and legs, scratched his flesh, and tore his hair. He screamed in agony as they ripped and tore his limbs out of their sockets. They tore the innards from his body as though they were gutting a hog. The last thing he saw before he died was the face of Belle looking down at him, smiling, with her blood-dripping, fang-filled mouth. That horrible mouth came ever closer. He knew what she wanted. She wanted his eyes.
Yes, our guests have taken their permanent seats. From New York to time infinite. Are you ready to join them? Perhaps another story will lure you. Choose a car, any car, for the time we had a permanent guest, as they tell their tales of horror at its best. Come, yes, join me. My name is Terror, who rides the rails eternally upon the terror train.
Survived this trek? No turning back. Dare resist, just try. Step back inside, we'll be your guide. So many ways to die. Upon this ride, nowhere to hide. With us, you shall remain. Upon this ride, this hellish ride, we call the Terror Train. Terror Train Podcast, Episode 121, Oregon to California. Produced by Krista Grabowski, David Schutz II, and Mary Genevieve Fortier. Podcast directed and arranged by David Schutz II. The Conductor, your narrator, was created by and played by David Schutz II. Terror, the Disembodied Voice, was created by and played by Mary Genevieve Fortier. Terror Train Podcast Opening and Closing Poems, written by Mary Genevieve Fortier. Host Segment Dialog for Terror, the Disembodied Voice, written by Mary Genevieve Fortier. Production music: The House of Leaves, Chase Pulse, The Hive, and The Voices by Kevin MacLeod, Incompetech.com. Featured work: This Train, written by Thomas M. Malafarina. Production music: Echoes of Time Version 2, Decisions, Ghost Story, Inner Sanctum, Ice Demon, Day of Chaos, Right Behind You, Classic Horror 2, and Red Letter by Kevin MacLeod, Incompetech.com. Additional sound effects by AudioSoundClips.com. Podcast program edited by David Schutz II. The stories and poems presented in the Terror Train podcasts are all featured in the James Ward Kirk Publishing anthology, Terror Train, which was edited by Krista Grabowski and A. Henry Keene. Cover art by Stephen Cooney. Content copyright 2014. Terror Train, Podcast Episode 121, Oregon to California. Copyright 2014.